¿Ya conoces las publicaciones del Centro Olof Palme? Te invitamos a conocer la seguridad humana y la seguridad multidimensional a debate. Amenazas, riesgos y vulnerabilidades en el mundo del siglo XXI. Bajo la autoría de 11 especialistas, coordinados por María Cristina Rosas. En esta obra aprenderás sobre diferentes aristas de la seguridad, relacionadas con el terrorismo, el proteccionismo, la energía, los derechos humanos, las relaciones norteamericanas, la delincuencia organizada y el poder naval, entre otros. Adquiere ya, la seguridad humana y la seguridad multidimensional a debate. Amenazas, riesgos y vulnerabilidades en el mundo del siglo XXI. Envíanos un mensaje a través de nuestras redes sociales para adquirir esta y otras obras del Centro Olof Palme México. Contáctanos hoy mismo.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our series called An Afternoon With, a series organized by the Olof Palme Center in Mexico City, where we have invited distinguished guests, diplomats, politicians, people in the cultural sector. And today we have a very special guest, and we are very honored to introduce Mr. Lloyd Axworthy, former Foreign Minister of Canada. I really appreciate your time and the fact that you are giving us some time to discuss a number of issues relevant for Canada, for Mexico, and the world. Welcome, sir.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Maria.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. I would like to introduce our guest. Dr. Axworthy's political career spanned 27 years, during 6 of which he served in the Manitoba Legislative Assembly and 21 in the Federal Parliament. He held several cabinet positions, notably Minister of Employment and Immigration, Minister responsible for the status of women, Minister of Transport, Minister of Human Resources Development, Minister of Western Economic Diversification, and Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1996 to 2000. Upon leaving public office, Dr. Axworthy served as Director and CEO of the Liu Institute for Global Issues at the University of British Columbia, prior to his appointment at the University of Winnipeg. In the foreign affairs portfolio, Dr. Axworthy became internationally known for his advancement of the human security concept. We are going to discuss that in a minute with him. In particular, the Ottawa Treaty, a landmark global treaty banning anti-personnel landmines. For his leadership on landmines, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. For his efforts in playing a pivotal role in establishing the International Criminal Court and the Protocol on Child Soldiers, he received the North-South Prize of the Council of Europe. Since leaving public life in the fall of 2000, Dr. Axworthy has been the recipient of several prestigious awards and honors. The Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation presented him with the Senator Patrick Leahy Award in recognition of his leadership in the global effort to outlaw landmines, to ban the use of children as soldiers, and to bring war criminals to justice. Princeton University awarded him with the Madison Medal for his record of outstanding public service. He received the Kerr International Humanitarian Award, and he was elected honorary fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Axworthy has been named the Order of Manitoba and to the Order of Canada and has received honorary doctorates from 12 universities. In 2004, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed Lloyd Axworthy as his special envoy for Ethiopia, Eritrea, to assist in implementing a peace agreement between the East African countries. In 2006, the Organization of American States appointed him to lead the OAS Electoral Observation Mission that monitored the 2006 general elections in Peru. He served as a member of the UNDP Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, which released the report Making the Law Work for Everyone in 2008. Lloyd Axworthy remains involved in international matters and lectures widely in Canada, the US, and abroad. His book, Navigating a New World, Canada's Global Future, was published in the fall of 2003. Dr. Lloyd Axworthy retired as President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Winnipeg following two full terms, 10 years, in June 2014. Currently, the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy is the chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council and one of Canada's leading voices on global migration and refugee protection. I would like to remind our audience here in Zoom and those of you who are following us in Facebook Live that you can place questions for our guests either here or in Facebook, and we will bring them to the attention of our guests. That said, I would like to start by asking Dr. Axworthy, what's your take on today's world challenges and the lessons we need to learn from this pandemic?
Well, there's an old saying about problems come in battalions, and I think we're all facing just an incredible set of existential challenges for which we don't really have a playbook or a manual. I think so much of what is happening, beginning with the epidemic that we're all through, we should have known about it. We've been facing epidemics for the last several thousand years, but for reasons that a lot of commentators are trying to dig into, we just weren't ready. We just didn't understand, and I think that it's put at some real challenge the issue of government and its ability to respond to a major global epidemic, to the climate change issue, which feeds into it, to the increasing rise of authoritarian governments. And there's a posse of political leaders who simply want to exploit people's sense of mistrust and grievance to propel themselves into power. You're dealing still with the major issue of nuclear weapons. I mean, one of the, it doesn't get the kind of headlines, but all the major nuclear powers are investing tens of billions of dollars in renewing their arsenals. And we also have a kind of underlying issues dealing with corruption and drug cartels that are really undermining our social fabric. So, it's tough to be in government these days. I mean, there's just a lot of issues that need response. And there is a question as to how effective or our capacity is. And we're not really into a renewal. There's a lot of rhetoric about let's get back to normal. Well, I think getting back to normal would simply getting back to a lot of practices, which the epidemic itself has really revealed as being quite iniquitous and unequal and risky. And so I think, I guess to put a sort of focus on your question, I think we have to rethink a little bit how we do things. How do we get people more deeply involved and trusting in their governments? How do we make our institutions more equitable? And how do we certainly begin to, I think particularly, work to ensure that we don't turn over to young men and women of a new generation such heavy burdens that they feel just totally frustrated. I think that to me is one of the great tasks of our time for my generation, is to find a way to make a transition so that we can lighten their load.
You mentioned very important issues such as nuclear weapons. Happily, at the beginning of this year, the treaty banning nuclear weapons came into force.
That's right.
But still, nuclear weapons are there, and major powers who own nuclear weapons didn't sign the agreement. So that remains a major challenge. And then you mentioned corruption, which is, a very, very difficult problem to sort out. We suffer a lot from that, and we need to work more to fight corruption. You mentioned that we need to think about how we do things, and when we speak about going back to normal, there's always this question. What does that mean? What is normal? What does normal mean? Because prior to the pandemic, we had a world of inequalities. We had a world with poverty, with nuclear arms, with disparities, with a number of problems that are still there. And probably the pandemic has just, show us that things can go worse. So I believe we have a major task in trying to find a solution, and probably the answer is cooperation, of which we have seen little during this pandemic. So I would like to know how do you feel about human security today? Human security, as we recall, was initially sponsored by the UNDP in 1994. It's been a long time since this happened, and Canada adopted this as a major issue in its foreign policy. But then we had the 9/11 attacks and many dramatic events. But still, we believe in many parts of the world that human security is relevant for today's problems. So what's your take on that?
I think that what has happened as the epidemic has become global is we realized that the commitments that used to be so strongly felt and acted upon by countries great, large, small, and medium, has broken down. I mean, to me, one of the really sad sort of outcomes from the epidemic is that countries who are wealthy, well-developed, capable, were of course primarily interested in serving their own populations, but they lost the ability to understand that if they don't share responsibility with those who aren't so well endowed, then it's going to come back and bite us. And the ability to distribute and allocate resources, not just in regional or political terms, but there's all kinds of populations that again have been revealed to be probably the most vulnerable, those who have been most affected, are frontline workers, workers in services, people who have to be at the job every day. They can't retreat to their country house and plug in on Zoom to do their business. Yeah. I think we've also really begun to see that the ability to collaborate on these issues is very limited. The G7 meeting, Canada's a member of the G7, it came up with some nice rhetoric, but no real action. I mean, so here's I don't see any international institutions, the United Nations, again, passed resolutions, but in actually terms of working on it. So the World Health Organization has been defunded in so many ways. Its capacity has been reduced. And when it comes to, let's talk about the issue of corruption, it's kind of being treated as an ad hoc issue, country by country. One of the things that I think is really important to pursue is the idea of an international anti-corruption court, similar to what we did with the International Criminal Court. That if countries aren't able or willing to prosecute those who are in corruption or bring them to accountability, then it may be an international responsibility to do that. That's where you need to start thinking about a kind of an institutional reformation in many ways. On the climate, we're I don't know if you've been following the news out of Canada recently, but we had temperatures in Western Canada, where I live,
True.
Close to 40 degrees centigrade. We've never had those temperatures before in our lives. And we now have 300 or 400 forest fires and towns are being burned. And we weren't ready for that. I mean, we just didn't believe it was ever going to happen to us. Oh, sure, it's going to, you could have a heat wave in Mexico and Southern California, but not in British Columbia, and not in Alberta, not in Manitoba, and now it's going east. So it just shows that our ability to imagine, we're losing our imagination in a sense of being able to foresee just what these things can do. But when it comes down to resolving it, you know, we're making all kinds of commitments. Well, we're going to have electrical cars by 2035. We're going to have carbon taxes. We're going to begin to pull back on using coal and fossil fuels by 2050. Well, by that time, it's too little and too late. And I think that, to me, is worrisome, because I think, going back to your observation about our use of human security, back in the 90s, when I was foreign minister, we had just gone through a kind of juncture point where the Cold War broke down, the Iron Curtain came down. We all of a sudden said, let's think something new. We don't have to be caught into that kind of Cold War rut. And the human security said to me, what we have to be concerned about is the protection of those who are people, ordinary people, those people who are vulnerable. And that means that we have to extend the concept of security to how do you protect on health, on employment, on children's rights. I mean, one of the things that we're involved with very actively now at the World Refugee Migration Council, we put together a task force that includes Canada, US, Mexico, Central American countries. So begin looking at how do we find a regional collaborative approach, because you can't do it by yourself. And the people who are most affected are those young kids on the caravans who are ending up in homes sort of separated from their families. And yet, where's the protection coming from? I mean, there's again a lot of lip service, but in terms of real action. And I think that's why the human security concept still has an awful lot of relevance. In fact, more relevance than even it had in the 1990s. But it's much tougher to implement, because I think we've fallen into a sort of contrary, adversarial issue. I think 9/11 recreated the fact that terrorism was the issue, militarization was the answer. And as a result, we don't have the tools or the idea or the commitments or the willpower or the firepower to come to grips with those kinds of risks that we've been talking about.
Okay, before going to the migration issue, because we're going to discuss that extensively during the interview, I would like to ask you about leadership, because, well, you already mentioned the end of the Cold War and the way human security as a concept developed, and later how it became prominent in the political agenda of several countries, including Canada. But still, I believe that times change, as you already mentioned. I believe that by the time the human security concept came into the scenario, there was still hope in institutions and the leadership of some states, the US, for instance, or Canada, for instance. But now we are seeing this pandemic with crisis, I believe, of institutions. People don't trust the UN, don't trust the World Health Organization, for instance. That's very sad. But also we see divided societies, such as the US, as a Mexican society, and many other societies. So I believe we are facing a crisis of leadership. What's your opinion on this?
Well, you know, leadership is not something that you kind of shake a bottle and out it comes. I mean, it's got to be developed. I think that my own experience, as you mentioned, I started in political life. I was first elected when I was 32, and now I'm in my early 80s. That's a long period to be involved. But I learned, it was an apprenticeship, experience, judgment, skills, connections, networking. And right now we seem to have this kind of notion that we can pop somebody out from who's been a celebrity or head of a game show or whatever, and all of a sudden they're going to be the savior on the white horse. And I think we're finding that celebrity or fame is not a criteria for becoming an effective leader.
Right.
And I think in particular, Maria, it's a whole big topic that, but I'm struck by recalling the words of Anne Applebaum, who wrote a book on the crisis of democracy, is I think the advent of the internet, of webs, means that a lot of people who have always had grievances, who have always been disaffected, can now connect. They now find people with similar views. So it's no longer having somebody lamenting on a bar stool somewhere. Now they turn on their iPad and away they go. And all of a sudden, so we've seen, for example, in the United States, the polarization that's taking place. I don't think that would be taking place if you didn't have Fox News and you didn't have wealthy billionaires paying to set up specialized websites and organizations that can use the web to provide false information, to mobilize people who are unhappy and disaffected. And I think democratic governments have been a little bit lax or not as effective in responding to that. I think we have a parliamentary system in Canada, and our parliament only meets virtually these days. So all the context, I guess the social capital, political capital that I enjoyed as a parliamentarian, meeting people behind the curtains, in the cafes, having breakfast, going to their daughter's wedding. It doesn't happen anymore. We've already become atomized in a way. And so I think there's a lot of causes. I'm not despairing. I think one thing that I've been struck by as we've gone through this 2021 period is the emergence of women leaders who seem to bring a somewhat, they're not all perfect, but they seem to bring a different level of concern and action because I think they're fresh on it. And I think the protests in the streets are leading increasingly people to realize that they have to participate in decisions. There's an old saying, I think it was a Italian philosopher named Gramsci said, the old way is dying, the new way hasn't quite taken its place. And I think we're into that kind of zone right now where we have to make those transitions.
True. Okay, well, let's go into the migration issue, which is very, very, it's very important for Mexico, for the US, for Canada. And you are the head of the World Refugee Migration and Migration Council. And I would like you to describe briefly the work this council does and the relevance of the task force for the analysis of the situation in Central America and Mexico, such. Please.
Well, I think the council really had its origin at the outset of the United Nations conferences to provide a new global compact on migration and a compact on refugees. And it was a chance to redefine so many of the areas because, I'm sure people viewing in have a pretty good sense, but the concept of being a refugee was really a product of the World War II experience with people coming out of Eastern Europe and Russia or the Soviet Union. And it's a very narrow definition. People feeling persecution. Didn't talk about people who were starving. It didn't talk about people who were being violated, as many refugee women and kids are. It wasn't talking about people being affected by natural disasters. So there's a chance to do some new thinking. But for many of us in different parts of the world who had experience at the United Nations, I've been president of the Security Council and things of that kind, we realized that the UN is required to work at the lowest common denominator because every country has its sovereignty and wants to assert it. And therefore, it's not always able. I don't know how many people know that the the budget for the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, which is doing incredible work, but it's all based on donations. It's like raising money for your kids, a prom dance or something. Countries have to pledge, and what we're finding now is the pledges aren't nearly enough, and oftentimes the pledges aren't honored. And so this whole idea that we have to rethink how do you fund and finance the international work on refugees and migrants was a major question. And that's what we came together as a council, maybe about 30 people from different parts of the world, policy practitioners, academics, civil society groups, former diplomats, and clearly people who were themselves refugees and migrants who had a lot to say. And we decided that we'd get together to work on concrete, practical issues in a way that provides solutions, not more speeches. And I think that's been our basic mantra. We came up with a report in 2019 called an action report. And step by step, we're trying to implement that in terms of looking at refinancing, establishing a basic concept of shared responsibility, because 80%, maybe even more, of refugees are hosted by countries next door to where the disruption is taking place, and oftentimes they're poor. They don't have the capacity, the abilities, the institutions, and we've increasingly becoming sort of turning our backs on resettlement, of funding, of support, and that is why I think one of the initiatives that I want to bring to the attention of people who are listening in the region is that one of our main initiatives right now is to put together a task force to deal with the migration in the Americas, and to bring together. We have a number of people from Mexico and from Central America, Canada, US, who are trying to find out what's the best way that we can collaborate and work as a regional to share responsibility, to provide protection for those who have become displaced, to provide even, as President Biden is talking about, finding some root causes. How do we begin to use our development programs not to support more military aid and support, but to actually, or to support enforcement, that promote really development at the community level, where people can really go to work in their own area, in their own region, in their own city or town, to find answers to these things. So our purpose is to come up with recommendations, solutions, try them out if necessary. We have a project going in Colombia right now. We were able to provide a way of private sector financing for housing for refugees coming from Venezuela. We have an effort to link up refugee women who are being affected by the epidemic, so they have a place where their voices are heard. We're working really on what's the connection between climate change and displacement and migration. All these issues, because we think that there needs to be a continuing source of fresh thought and fresh perspectives. And that's really the work of the council.
Great. So what could the council focus more? International migration or also internal displaced people? Because you already mentioned the problem of internal displaced people, which is terrible in Colombia, in Mexico now due to the criminal organizations. Are you working on that also?
Yes, clearly. I think because there's a clear connection. People who are displaced internally, if they continue to be abandoned, then they have to move internationally. Borders no longer become, significant until they get to meet them. And when the borders are closed, then that's where the issue. There's a logjam, as we see right now on the Mexican-U.S. border. Some 300,000 people, are kind of banging on the gates in effect. Now, if you've been able to provide effective support in Honduras, in southern Mexico, for people to have a place where they can be find security, where they can find some employment, where they find some good health care, then the same pressures aren't there. And so you have to continue to work back. And it's just a classic example of how what's global is also local. And I think you have to find the ways of making sure that you layer your responses. There's an international global response, and then there's a local direct response on the ground, the grassroots. And in between, there's different layers: regional, cities and towns, agencies. And that, to me, it's a complex network. But I think that's really the challenge of our time, is how to make those networks mesh together.
What you mentioned seems to be very much in line with what the Mexican president is trying to do with Central America. You know about these social programs he's sponsoring,
Yes, I do.
Sowing Lives, and programs to, you know, give opportunities to young people, to people, so that they don't abandon their countries. And this also is looking at the possibility of mitigating migration pressures. What do you think about these policies?
Well, I think it demonstrates that there has to be a sort of outreach, and that what happens inside Mexico, dealing with those who are coming out of, I think it's called the Iron Triangle, it needs to be, but I think there has to be support for that. I mean, it's no, you just can't ask the Mexican taxpayer to bear the root. Ask Canadians, ask Americans, ask some of the big foundations, ask our private sector, and we can help mobilize those things. I mean, before I came on this program, I was at a meeting of a working group of our America's task force, and one of the important things that we're talking about is how could there is increasingly a lot of interesting work being done about how you open up employment pathways to make sure that refugee and displaced persons are included. I mean, Canada has, right now, we have over 100,000 Mexican and Central American agricultural workers to come up. Now, what the epidemic shows is we're not been very good at protecting their health or their rights, for that matter. So we have to work together collaboratively between the countries to make sure that pathway that promises some form of employment and also enables people who are facing this displacement to have security while they're waiting. Maria, let me give you an example. When I was the immigration minister in the 1980s, it was my first big cabinet job under Pierre Trudeau, and Mr. Trudeau's, our present prime minister's father. And at the time, we were facing, as you might recall, major migration in Indochina because of the war had come to an end. People were fleeing. Hundreds of thousands of people were on small boats, and like many of them today are in the Mediterranean and other oceans, being cascaded. A group of 15 countries got together. I think our first meeting was in Hawaii, mainly immigration ministers, to talk about how do we work together. And one of the first things that we did, and something we learned as Canadians, is to establish major security centers in Hong Kong, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, where people could come. They would be safe, they would be well fed, they'd have good health, and they could be processed for resettlement in other countries. You didn't have to go to the border and cram into a camp in Tijuana. You could do it in your own country. You could do it in Mexico, but that takes resources. And I think that's where the idea of cooperation and sharing responsibility is so important to register. And that's where I think our council is trying to get people to say, look at, elected governments nationally, obviously see their first priority is the protection of their own people. But I think what we're saying is, but you're not going to stop the displacement if you don't come to grips not only with the causes of it, but also in ways of helping to adapt to it and to mitigate it. And I think that one of the sources now we're discovering for the migration out of the Central Americas has been climate change, the hurricanes,
Yes.
just the droughts,
Yes.
the lack of water. And if I always go on the basis that we always thought the conflict was the only cause of refugees. And my view was you can be frightened for your life by having a young kid put a rifle to your head, or you can also be increasingly frightened if your crop is burnt up and there's no water and you have to find a place to feed your family. I mean, that's the concept of human security right there. And I think that's where we have to move it into a much broader dialogue and discussion.
You mentioned the climate change refugees, but I was thinking about also the case of Haiti, the earthquake
Yes.
refugees. We got a lot of them.
That's right.
This terrible earthquake. And yes, I like the idea of bringing everyone together to sort the migration challenge out. What would you say is the major change if there's a change, of course, in the Biden administration on these issues with respect to the prior administration, the Trump administration? It seems to me that Biden is more cooperative, but I would like to know the view of an expert.
Look, not only more cooperative, he's more humane.
Yes.
He's less erratic, and he's not nasty. He's not mean. I mean, Donald Trump was a very mean man, and the people around him were mean. I mean, in my experience in international, I met a lot of different people, but from time to time, I met people who I just thought were evil. You know, I met people who were warlords. I met people who were dictators. I had to sit down. I knew this is an hombre I didn't want to make a friend. And I got to say that the Trump administration and people like Stephen Miller, who were advising Trump, seemed to pick on the fact that they could sort of criminalize refugees and migrants as a basis of getting political support. Plus, I think that they just had this view that somehow, well, they were, to being blunt, they were white nationalists. If they didn't admit to, their basic spirit was of that kind. And I think as a result that there has to be a response to those kinds of things along the way. Yeah? And I think that's where we're at with the Biden administration. I think the fact that the vice presidents have been given that mandate is really a very important one to follow through on. And that's where I hope one of our efforts on this America's Task Force is to try to share some of these ideas with the Biden administration, because I think that part of the political pressure they're under from the right wing and from the anti-immigrant crowd and the white nationalist crowd is to, if the Biden administration can show that other countries share their concerns and share the responsibility and share the resources, it gives a strong message. You don't have to do this just by yourself. You're the most powerful country in the world, but even the most powerful country can't solve all the problems. And this way, I think the idea of a cooperative America's approach could be and should be something that I would hope that the Mexican government would see that as an outlet. We're working with our own government in Canada. I'm working with people I know from the government because of my history with them. We've got Madeleine Albright is a member of our task force.
Right.
She clearly has her own connections. We've got the former president of Costa Rica. We've got the former foreign minister of El Salvador. We've got people with really, Rafael Castro, who's the head of the U.S.-Mexico Studies Center at the University of California. And these are people who have access, who have real capacity. And we're now working with a number of the groups like the Inter-American Dialogue, the Migration Policy Institute. I mean, we've tried to put together a very kind of skillful and impressive group of people to get the ideas into the policy center. And here's something, Maria, that I'd be interested in your response. One of the things that we're discovering in our discussions is that one of the institutions that still has a level of trust in Mexico and the Honduras, Guatemala, is the church. That people still respond, and that the church, like the Sabrini groups and stuff, we have a Cardinal Riazini from Guatemala, who's a member of our task force. I'm going to tell you, I mean, I think their capacity and capability, because they're on the ground, they're where people are, again, can and should be reinforced. And part of our purpose is to say, how do we mobilize the best capacity of faith-based groups, and whether evangelical or Catholic or Protestant, I mean, whatever the case may be, how do you put that to work?
Well, that's difficult to answer, but from my experience, some religious groups have been very, very important in helping migrants, Central American migrants that come into Mexico, because they provide help and shelter and all that. So that's speaking about an immediate response to the challenge, because undocumented migrants into Mexico are very unprotected, as you know. So religious groups have been of critical relevance in helping them to continue their way, right? And well, apart from that, it seems difficult to have all the religious groups working together. Sometimes I find that we are a very divided society, and religious groups also, yes, are like that. It's very difficult to bring people together, which is why I'm very much interested in the strategy you mentioned. Bring the people together. Well, that's the way to do it, but it's always difficult to have everybody.
And it may also be a way of breaking down those silos that have been created. Because if you find a common concern that you're going to work together on, then you realize that the other people aren't bad people. They're not your enemy or adversary. So here's an experience I want to share with you, because I think it's the one that I think could be used in Mexico, and certainly used in the United States. Going back to that time when I was an immigration minister, we had passed a new Immigration Act just a year or two before, 1978, before 79, 80 came. And one of the sort of measures in there that was primarily promoted by civil society groups was what we call personal sponsorship, which meant that we gave the opportunity for local groups. There could be a church group, or there could be a neighborhood group, there could be people in a business, there could be students, would have the right to sponsor refugee families. And that means when they would come, they would have a place to come to, they would be helped. Where do I find a school? Where do I get a job? Where's my health care? And for the first year, it was people themselves who were providing that basic foundation. And when we started doing some follow-up studies, found out that the people who had become sponsors of refugee, particularly in that period, became much more publicly minded, much more a sense of responsibility, much more open to immigration and refugees. Whereas they felt they were part of the solution. They weren't simply watching something on their TV set or on their internet. All of a sudden, they were part of the answer. And now 50%, when we had the Syrian refugees come to Canada in 2016, 50% of them were sponsored by private organizations. And boy, does that create a whole. So right now, you'd be surprised to hear. I mean, we all hear about the anti-immigration Senate. In Canada, there's one of our public survey companies, Environics, does an annual study of Canadian attitudes on immigration, refugees, and migration. It's actually increased in its support in the last couple of years. So rather than being beaten down and reducing, this experience, I think, has also given people a sense. So we're one of the few countries where 75% of the population are full support of bringing more people to the country.
True. Well, we have some questions coming from the audience in Facebook.
Sure.
So Carlos Gutierrez asks us, how is vaccination, I assume COVID-19 vaccination, how is proceeding vaccination for migrants, internal displaced peoples, and refugees?
I think internationally, it's almost a forgotten responsibility. I told you earlier about we've helped work with a global network of women, and we every couple of months open up the network so that people can speak their mind, what's going on. And I've been struck by a comment I heard that I carry with me every day. A woman said, you know, it used to be that we're the last in the queue when it came to public health or support. Now we're not even in the queue. We've just been abandoned. And, you know, because governments are focusing on their own populations and they're putting up walls, and in many cases, you know, they're using, for legitimate health reasons, they don't want people crossing their borders, or they put them into heavy quarantines or things of that kind. So it's really affected, but rather than thinking through it, saying, well, we can still invite people to come, but they have to wait a period of time and have to have checks as to whether they're infected or not. I mean, but that there's not an awful lot of work being done on that particular issue. And I think that as a result, it does come to something that I think is really an important, vital issue, and that is we have to find a way of democratizing or giving more participation, more empowerment. We talked about the UN Commission I was on empowerment of women. If you don't empower people, give them a voice, let them participate, then you've just created, they're the people who are going to become disaffected. They're going to become radicalized. They're going to become extremists, or they're simply going to die or lose any hope. And I think we can't afford to do that.
There's a question here in Zoom. It says, since Canada's accession to the OAS, what is the current panorama between Canada and the countries of Latin America? What are Canadian foreign policy interests in our region?
Well, can I be very personal about that? Well, you know, I think Canada made major contributions when we were in government to suddenly establish a unit of democracy inside the OAS. And when I was foreign minister in 2000, we held the General Assembly of the OAS in Windsor, the town right on the Canada-US border.
Right.
At the time, the big issue that was kind of roiling the organization was the corruption and the election fraud that was going on in Peru with then President Fujimori.
Yes.
So I chaired the assembly. I kind of opened my big mouth and said, no, maybe the OAS should step in to actually apply a human security concept. A week later, I was on an airplane with the Secretary General of the OAS and our ambassador, and we were welcomed to Peru. We set up a system of what we call tabula de dialogue, tables of dialogue, to talk about a new constitution for Peru. And the president at the time, the outgoing president, kind of agreed that should happen. And so we worked to establish a better framework for elections, for making sure that the fraudulent couldn't take place. It wasn't perfect. But the follow-up for that is in 2004, 2005, I think it was, I was invited again by the OAS to lead the election observation mission, to go to the time and kind of reconcile the left and the right who were competing for the office. And I think the OAS has an enormous ability, but it has to overcome this notion that somehow sovereignty is paramount. Sovereignty is only as good as the ability of the government to protect the people that they're been elected or chosen to represent. And so I think the OAS, to be honest, lately has not been very activist, but it has the capacity to be so. And that goes back to your previous comment, leadership.
I'm curious. You mentioned that you approached the OAS for the Peru elections, and that in that context, and you propose a human security approach. You know that the OAS has a multidimensional security approach. That's a concept they coined in 2003 that is different. It's not the same as human security. So what do you think about the multidimensional security concept of the OAS?
Well, I think it's basically, its major result has been very active militarization throughout the Americas.
Okay.
I think that's been the result. The multilateral, what they call the multi security pacts, the Rio. I mean, all these agreements basically came down that, and as an example, the major U.S. contribution to all that was coming from the Defense Department. The major part of the aid projects were for military support. Now, armies are important, but armies shouldn't be expected to do border control. They shouldn't be expected to deal with you have to really work at improving your own agencies of police, of borders, of penitentiaries, of managing agriculture. I mean, that to me is the multidimensional approach, not simply kind of layering in more and more responsibility onto the armed forces.
You're right. You know that the previous government in Mexico supported a multidimensional Washington-style approach on security, which had very poor results in dealing with security and development issues, of course. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no. I think there's, I don't criticize necessarily the military.
No.
But they're being asked to do things they're not being trained to. It's not part of their ethos. There's a limit as to how far you can go. Now, I think a lot of them do interesting work in disaster relief and things of that kind. But to provide a resolution of migration issues with a military mindset and with a lack of training, where you don't have special skills, and I think one of the areas, which to go back to my kind of premise about collaboration, one thing that I think we should be working with is to help train border systems, to train how do you provide proper asylum, how do you support efforts to give people security without having to have somebody standing there with an AK-47. I mean, those are the kind of things that we really have to work at if we're going to come to grips really with the migration issue.
Okay. We have a couple of more questions before finishing this interview. And again, I thank you for being so kind and participating in this very interesting discussion. It's Laura Sanchez who asks us if Canada can return to be an important peacekeeper in the world. I believe she refers to the Blue Helmets, the role Canada played as a major peacekeeper during the Cold War.
I hope so. I'm afraid the present government, and I'm not here to be a critic of a government, but I think Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, when he was elected, said Canada is back. But right now, if you talk about peacekeeping, I think we have about 12 peacekeepers around the world. Yes. We're not back. And the reason is that something happened. We got drawn in very actively into the Afghan, I guess you would call intervention. And our military, took the view that they didn't want to do peacekeeping; they wanted to fight. And we've never come back on that. We never established. When I was foreign minister during that '90s period, for example, we spun off from peacekeeping a notion of peace building, that we would put money and resources and people into helping establish local institutions, helping to set up. We did in Guatemala. We were very much a major supporter of the constitutional discussions in Guatemala. So those are the issues that I think, but I would hope that maybe the Mexican government and others would send a message to our own government. We'd like to have you back in real terms. It doesn't mean you do peacekeeping like we did in 1956 when Mr. Pearson from Canada won the Nobel Peace Prize. But I think in terms of dealing with conflict, protection of civilians, protection of children, making sure that there is an effort to cope and manage the ability to migrate without feeling that you're totally at the prey of a cartel or of a gang. Those are the areas that I think, to me, are modern definitions of peacekeeping. And that's where I think we should be putting our resources.
Okay, so it could be more a preemptive and also a peace-building approach in your
That's
view?
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, another question, and then we will move to a conclusion. Yes, there's a question about North American summits that we were used to having before Trump into power. After Donald Trump, we haven't seen any of this. Do you expect North American summits between Mexico, the US, and Canada to happen again in the near future?
Oh, yes. I think one of my wonderful experiences was to be part of the Three Amigos meeting with Rosario Green and Madeleine Albright, and I was the only hombre there. But we started to do a number of integrated issues. We were talking about the issue of water, for example. How do the Americas come to grips with managing freshwater resources? We came to grips with the rights of women. So now here is something that I would really like to see. I hope it's one of the recommendations that we'll make as a task force, and that is to repurpose the Three Amigo meeting and invite representatives, both governmental and non-governmental, from the Americas, from the Central America, to have a special day-long session on migration. That could be the beginning of the collaboration we're talking about. We have the vehicle there. I'm glad the question was asked. I think that could really be a catalyst to start working on a more broad-based regional collaborative approach. And I know that Madeleine feels the same way.
Yeah. Well, there's another question I wouldn't like to skip because it's been asked insistently in many occasions, and it's about the status of relations between Mexico and Canada. It's been said that and the visa issue, you remember that in 2016, the relation deteriorated very rapidly, and it has not recovered from that. How do you see this?
Well, again, I found that here's a comment. We've been able to provide very close, active collaboration when it came to a North American free trade agreement. Why aren't we doing the same thing on migration, on climate change, on issues of corruption? And I think that it really means that you have to mobilize your ministries to think in a holistic way, not simply in separate little sort of silos along the way. And that's why I think this task force is important, because we have a very good ambassador right now in Mexico, Graham Clark. Yes. He's terrific. But he was the ambassador in Peru when I was down there working on the elections. And we've got a number of really good ambassadors we had. But I think where we're falling down, and I'm saying this very critically, is our ministry. We don't have senior ministers going to Mexico every 3 months and having dialogue. I'm sure they meet up at certain sort of conferences, but I really think that we have to have a much closer collaboration because we all occupy the same geography. We're all in the same hemisphere, and the issues are not something that you can divide up. So I'm saying if you can do it for trade, should we not start thinking about doing it on human security issues?
Okay. Yes, and we have common problems or solutions, possibly. Yes, the US, China, all this.
Well, I mean, Maria, just one thing. The issue of energy and how do you begin to transfer out of fossil fuels is one that all three, I mean, our economy has been very much sort of founded on gas and oil. Mexico has the same thing. The United States is fossil fuel dependent. These are issues we should be discussing with each other.
True. Hopefully in a North American summit and beyond.
Absolutely.
Hopefully.
Well, let's say you get out there and talk about the need to bring the three amigos together to collaborate with their brothers and sisters from Central America on the issue of migration.
Okay. Fair enough. So I would ask you, a conclusion, a final remark on, the current situation, the future of North America, including the three amigos. What would you say?
Well, I'm always a kind of eternal optimist. I guess it's partly just something I've learned, but I think in spending 30 or 40 years in public service in a variety of ways, I think that we're capable of doing better than we're doing. And I really think that that to me is a mantra. And we have to say to a young generation, you've got the talent, you've got the education, you've got the ethos. We've discovered that our young people in Canada are extremely open, tolerant on immigration issues, on multiracial issues and things. I think that there's a great capacity, but what we have to convince them is make government a positive force in implementing those issues. Don't turn it down. Get inside, work away on it. And that was a choice I made when I was in my early 20s. I decided I was going to go into politics because I thought that was a way of finding, to me, it was a calling, not a job.
Okay. Thank you very much. I was thinking that we need to do this more often. We need to talk to each other because that way we can know each other's requirements and aspirations and such. So in this respect, I want to thank you for being with us this afternoon. And I hope we can discuss these matters again in the near future. And I also want to thank the audience here in Zoom and in Facebook Live. We invite you for next week's interview. We will be having Sergio Abreu, the Secretary General of ALADI, the Latin American Association of Integration. And we also ask you, if you desire to do so, to follow us in our social networks. That said, thank you again, Mr. Axworthy. Thank you to the Canadian Ambassador to Mexico. I didn't mention that before, but Mr. Greme Clark was instrumental in having Mr. Axworthy with us today. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. He's a great ambassador. We're very proud of what he does.
Yes, he is.
Maria,
thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure too. Bye-bye.